Okay, 1 Samuel 15 tonight. We are continuing with Saul, and it is an important moment tonight in the kind of trajectory of Saul's reign. It's not going to end tonight, but I think you could say the final nail is put in the coffin of his reign tonight. God will reject Saul, but I think Saul rejects God and God rejects Saul is kind of the storyline tonight. Also, the chapter tonight, 1 Samuel 15, is a favorite. I'm going to say top 2, top 3 of a group called the New Atheists that they use to attack the moral foundations of God in the Old Testament. So you'll see what I'm talking about right off the bat. Let's get into the text starting in verse 1. Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts. I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So, that's a challenging text. We have kind of two big jobs tonight as we work through this text. One is we want to understand the importance of how Saul responds to that, and specifically how he doesn't respond to that tonight. But first we need to talk about this command that's given. The morality, if you will, of this command. We have literally a "thus saith the Lord," and it involves the complete destruction of a group known as the Amalekites. He is to lead his army in a total destruction of these people, men, women, children, infants, and down to the donkeys, down to all the animals that they have. And so the objection is pretty simple. You can already kind of figure out what it is. It's something like this. God ordered genocide in 1 Samuel 15. Therefore, those who believe in the God of the Bible believe in a God who condones, even commands genocide, commands something evil to be done. And so it's kind of like mic drop, end of the story. That's our argument right there. And on the one hand, this challenge for us is very serious as believers, because it does, the text does raise a lot of questions, to be sure. On the other hand, it's a huge opportunity for us. And let me explain that, because if you can take one of the 3 or 4 most difficult passages of the Bible, and you can, what is one of the biggest and best resources for those who want to challenge the Old Testament, and if you can make sense of that, if you can provide some reasonable explanation for that passage, and you're able to do that with one of the most challenging passages, then it certainly suggests that you would be able to provide reasonable explanations to other objections raised with other passages in the Bible. So if this were a court of law and I were a lawyer, I would concede several things. I would concede God really said this. I would concede, yes, this is a command from God. I accept what the text actually says there. And I would concede that it has been accurately recorded for us. Now some have, and I say that because some have argued that, the Bible actually is misleading here. God didn't actually order that. That was really Samuel's idea, and he just said, this is coming from God. But it's really Samuel that is saying this here. And others have said, the Bible is just wrong. This is just added. Shouldn't have been added. God never ordered this. Neither he nor Samuel ordered this. So anyway, there are those that say that. Just take my word for it. But what we're going to do is we're going to concede, no, this is actually what God wanted to happen, what God ordered to happen. We're going to accept it and deal with it as is. So let's go. To understand chapter 15, and actually embedded in those verses, if you were listening closely, there is a prior episode. There's something from the history of these two groups, the Israelites and the Amalekites, and the text itself points to something that happened previously. So in actuality, these two groups have a long history. It goes way back to Jacob and Esau, all right? You remember how Esau gave away or sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob's name actually was changed to Israel. So Israel then, or Jacob, has these sons, and they become the fathers of these tribes. Esau's people continued to exist. They're known as the Edomites or the Amalekites. The Agagites at different points, so we'll get into some of that tonight. But these groups, including the Amalekites, are descendants of Esau, and so really the friction started way back with their great grandfathers. And so after Esau abandons his birthright and his claim to God's promise, he diverges, he physically separates from God's people now, Jacob his brother and Jacob's descendants, the covenant people. So in one sense, the Amalekites were a group who had opted out of the covenant with God. We should not confuse the Amalekites with the Canaanites. There are differences, big differences. The Canaanites actually occupy the promised land. They live in the promised land, the land promised to Abraham. The Amalekites did not live in the promised land. So Israel was not a threat to the Amalekites, historically speaking. Israel was not asked by God in the old, commands from God. Israel was not asked to command or to expel them from the land. No, the land is theirs. They can have that land. At least they aren't commanded to wage war with the Amalekites until later, until here, all right? Until 1 Samuel chapter 15. The relationship really turned sour when Jacob's descendants were freed from slavery in Egypt. Remember Abraham and Aaron and the plagues, and finally the Israelites are freed and they leave the land of Goshen. They cross the Red Sea and they are making their way toward the promised land, and that is where things got sideways between the Israelites and their kinsmen, the Amalekites. You see, on their way toward the promised land, they came into some territories controlled by Esau's descendants. And the Israelites, very nicely, very politely, very peaceably, negotiated. Hey, let's negotiate a safe passage. We're not going to take your stuff. We're not going to kill your people. We just want to go through. This is the most direct route to get where we need to go. And here's how it played out. In Numbers chapter 20, verse 17. The Israelites, please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway, not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory. We're not going to eat your stuff. We're not going to even drink your water. We're just going to go straight on through on the king's highway. But the answer that they got was rather surprising to their I think we could all agree, very reasonable request. Numbers 20:20-21. But he said, you shall not, this is the leader of the Amalekites here, you shall not pass through. And Edom came out against them with a large army and with a strong force. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. Right? So the Amalekites here, under the broader name, the Edomites, they hated Israel. They hated Israel since the beginning, since Esau and Jacob. And here, their kinsmen, their relatives, the Israelites, are in a very vulnerable state. I mean, these former slaves are beginning their pilgrimage. I mean, they're nothing like an army. There's not a lot scary about them. There's just a lot of them. And they are just headed toward their homeland. And the Edomites or the Amalekites would have known, yeah, that is their home. They knew the promises. They knew the promises. And so they're traveling from point A to point B. This is before Mount Sinai. The people of God are kind of haggard. You know, they're battling each day for battling figure metaphorically to feed the group and to provide water for the group. And it is at that point that their relatives, their kinsmen, attack. Right? Come at them with an army. And so the tribes were forced to fight their first military engagement very much not by their choice. This was not something the Israelites wanted to happen. And in Exodus chapter 17, we have the battle recorded. Moses is there. Joshua, his young lieutenant, son of Nun, is commanding the army there. And God delivers the Israelites. God gives them victory. Chapter 17, verses 13 to 16. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered. So we're going to remember this and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, for hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. So a little history, a little reference point here. It is important to note who started this, okay? Who was it that attacked who? And this is the Amalekites declaring war against Israel, not vice versa. And they are trying to destroy God's people in their most vulnerable hour. And they had absolutely no reason to do that. Right? So God's going to protect His people. These are the chosen people. These are the ones through whom the Messiah is going to come someday and bless all nations. And God is going to protect His people. And that's essentially what we have here. It's a recognition these guys are dangerous. I mean, if these neighbors are attacking us when they have no reason to attack us, we better watch out, right? So Moses lets everyone know that while they need to keep moving, while they're certainly not structured at all to deal with these new enemies, they're going to mark this because they know they're going to have to deal with these people at some point. So Numbers 14, fast forwarding, the Amalekites will attack Israel again when the tribes are continuing to wander through the desert, so they come at them again. Judges chapter 3, the Amalekites will form an alliance with the Midianites, and they will begin raiding and plundering Israel, attacking Israel again. Joshua chapter 6, the Amalekites will now invade Israel. And famously, Gideon will be called by God to defend the people against these Midianites and Amalekites. And so I was just thinking this week, imagine you got this guy named Frank, and he is like your mortal enemy, and he hates you. You don't really know why, but he hates you, and he is determined to murder you. And every couple of years, you can be sure he's going to pop out with a knife and try to stab you. Okay, just try to imagine. He's going to try to cut your throat. So generation after generation, chapter after chapter, story after story in the history of Israel, these guys keep popping up and keep trying to cut Israel's throat. I mean, that's what's going on with this group. So they are at war with the Jews, a war of their making. And since the Jewish people are God's chosen, they are at war with God. On the other side of 1 Samuel 15, they're going to pop up again. We're not done with them in 1 Samuel 15. David is going to fight the Amalekites a little later on. About 600 years later, they're going to pop up again in the story of Esther. Anybody remember the bad guy's name in the book of Esther? Mordecai's a good guy. Who's the bad guy? Haman. Haman is the bad guy. And we're going to read about him in the book of Esther. And guess who his ancestry, what his ancestry was? It was an Amalekite ancestry. In fact, in the book of Esther, he is called, I don't even know where this is on my notes, but in the book of, Esther chapter 3, verse 1, when Haman is introduced to us, he is called Haman the Agagite. Okay, that's a weird name, but that's what he's called. Haman the Agagite, which means he is a descendant of a guy named Agag, who we are going to read about in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Happens to be, at this point in time in 1 Samuel 15, happens to be the king of the Amalekites. So one of his descendants, 600 years later, is going to pop up, and Haman is going to try to do what? You remember the book of Esther. He's going to try, that's genocide. Haman is going to try to destroy all the Jewish people by royal order, and of course ends up, ironically, dying on the gallows that he built for Mordecai. So just so we're clear, the story we have tonight in 1 Samuel 15, it is a brutal story, but this is not a story of two neighbors that just, Israel just can't seem to get along with these guys. Israel may have certainly been hated and reviled by other neighboring countries or by the Canaanite peoples at times, but the Amalekites, next level hatred. Next level hatred right there. These guys wanted to wipe Israel off the map, and they had a chance when Israel was at its weakest and most vulnerable, when they were just pilgrims heading toward their home. They had a chance, and they took it. So for 2 to 4 years prior to 1 Samuel chapter 15, this group has been trying tooth and nail to wipe out the Israelites. And we know from the text tonight, we've seen already, they're the ones who've been picking this fight time after time. They're the ones who are doing the invading, who are doing the attacking. So it's pretty obvious this particular group was not interested in a peace settlement, all right? They were not ever interested in sitting down with the Israelites and negotiating some sort of settlement, since we've seen Israel try that before, and it did not work. They got attacked. So Israel, historically, is a light to the nations. The Amalekites could have, and should have had a special relationship with the children of Jacob. They were kinsmen. They should have gotten in on the blessing that was coming to the Jewish people. But if the Lord here is going to move his plan forward to bless all people, he's going to have to stop these guys. He's going to have to stop the Amalekites. But why the children, right? Why the children? Why the infants? Why do they have to die? Why was Saul supposed to include them in the destruction? That can't be right. I would go back to Haman. I would say certainly Haman, 6 centuries later, is part of the answer. I mean, obviously Saul did not fulfill that command the way he was supposed to. There were people that got out of there, the Amalekites, and kept reproducing, and somewhere down the line, you've got this guy Haman who grows up and wants vengeance for what happened to his people at the hands of the Jews and wants to wipe them out. So the Amalekites, this is just interesting kind of color commentary, I guess, if we're going to kind of finish the picture of who these guys were. First Samuel 15:33, we see that they were notorious for, in their military engagements, for killing the children and killing the infants. That was something that they had a habit of doing. But really, it goes back to Exodus chapter 17. It goes back to that time they basically ambushed their brothers who were coming out of Egypt. So erasing the Amalekites is the only way to guarantee, after battle, century, it is the only way to end this conflict, to end this existential threat to Israel. So, that's kind of the historical background of 1 Samuel chapter 15. It may not satisfy us, right? With our limited wisdom and understanding, it may not put us at ease, even knowing that history, but it gives us a better footing to understand historically what is going on here with this command in 1 Samuel 15. So historically speaking, the Amalekites had opportunities to negotiate with Israel, or to even surrender to God's people, or to join God's people in a support role. But 1 Samuel 15, but over and over again, they did not choose that route. So I would just say off the bat, 1 Samuel 15 doesn't look much like genocide to me. It doesn't look much like genocide when you understand the history. Now, there had been good faith attempts by Israel before to negotiate. We know this. There had been 4 to 6 centuries of, let's call it what it is, just patience. I mean, God could have just wiped these guys out, but there's a lot of time given to these guys to change their ways, to repent, for them to try a different strategy, to them to humble themselves before God before this command in 1 Samuel 15 is ever given. But they did not choose those routes. So this is not, I mean, it may be a lot of things and we may not agree or whatever from our point of view with this, but it's not genocide. One final point, and this one comes courtesy of our friend Peter J. Williams, who's been with us before from Cambridge. And I like what he talks about in passage, I don't know about this one specifically, but in other similar passages. Peter J. Williams points out that if you are going to fairly criticize a story, to morally criticize a story, or a character in a story, then you are really, to do that fairly, you are obligated to look at the whole story, to look at the narrative, the complete narrative, especially the protagonist, especially the main character in that story. I think we would all agree. If like you're going to criticize, Hamlet, or you're going to criticize Harry Potter, or you're going to have to look at not just one act, but the whole story going through. So let's talk about Harry Potter for a second. I think this is safe. It's been out long enough that if this is a spoiler for you, you probably should have seen the movies by now anyways, or read the book. So I'll just work with Harry Potter for a second. There's a character who, for 97% of the Harry Potter stories, he may not be the worst villain. That would be Voldemort, but he is definitely 1A, and that would be Professor Snape, Severus Snape. Always seems to be up to no good. Always seems to be playing for the Death Eaters. That's the bad team, all right, in the Harry Potter books. But in the end, spoiler alert, in the last book, you learn the entire time he was working for the Order of the Phoenix, the good guys. The entire time, he's like deeply embedded in this other side. He's actually, and at the end of the story, it all makes sense. You're like, wow, I did not see that coming. In fact, he becomes this heroic figure at the end of the Harry Potter books. So whether a story is fiction or nonfiction is irrelevant when it comes to making a moral critique of the story. I mean, we can criticize things in the Harry Potter stories. We can criticize things in Ivanhoe, or criticize things in, Mary Poppins. We can criticize things whether a story is fiction or nonfiction. Either way, you need to consider the whole narrative and the character of the main protagonist throughout the drama. Like, our protagonist is God, and he appears in 1 Samuel chapter 15. He's the one giving the order there. And God appears in the first chapter of the Bible, right? Genesis chapter 1. He is the source of all life. Nobody, no Amalekite, no Canaanite, no Israelite, nobody has life except through him. He is the source of all life. The whole universe owes their existence to him. And God has sort of a track record in the Old Testament, and the New Testament as well, but we'll focus on the Old Testament. He has a track record of working for the innocent, of working for the downtrodden, of actually working for the immigrant, for the outsider, for the foreigner, protecting those people. And he commands his people at different places to care for these vulnerable folks. And the character, whether you believe in the Bible or not, whether you believe in God or not, this protagonist in the story of the Bible, God, is presented in the story as having, among other things, infinite knowledge, infinite wisdom. To say he knows 1 billion times more than us, since his knowledge is infinite, that doesn't even scratch the surface, okay? He knows everything there is to know. He knows past, present, future. He alone is qualified to make moral decisions with a perfect understanding of how a decision today is going to ripple through next month, next year, 1,000 years from now, 1,000 generations from now. And so all of that, if we're going to criticize the story, whether you believe it's fiction or nonfiction, if you're going to criticize it fairly, you've got to consider the character of the protagonist of God. Now, back to the text in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Remember, Saul has been ordered to destroy everything, even the living property of the Amalekites, the animals. Okay? So here we go to chapter 15, verses 7 to 9. So, and Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. He took Agag, remember Agag, forefather of Haman. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatted calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. Now, there were we know this historically, other Amalekites made it out alive. How did they do that? Well, there's a number of possible explanations. One is Israel gave fair warning to the Kenites, who were kind of intermixed with the Amalekites. The Kenites had done them a solid when they were in their wanderings, and so I wouldn't say it's possible. I would say it's almost certain that some of the Amalekites were like, this is our chance to get out. We're going to kind of mix in with the Kenites, and we're going to get out of here. So that they made it out alive. But you also see Saul choosing to spare the life of the king, choosing to spare the life of Agag, and chooses also to preserve anything of value. Like if it's worth something, we're not going to destroy it. Stuff that he can't use in the text, stuff that is despised, stuff that is worthless, yeah, we're going to destroy all that stuff. But if it's got some value to us, we're going to go ahead and keep that. And so after the battle, the first thing he does is he goes to Carmel, Mount Carmel, and he sets up a monument in his own honor. Okay, that's interesting. Now, when Samuel, the prophet, aged prophet, finally catches up to Saul and confronts him with his disobedience, it's really kind of funny. Samuel finally catches up to him, and Samuel's like, and Samuel knows what's up. But it's interesting, he just kind of observes when he comes to Saul, seems like I hear an awful lot of bleating of sheep. Why is that? It seems like I hear a lot of lowing of the oxen. What's going on there? So I thought you were supposed to destroy all of these animals. And Saul responds, whoa. You know, I see where you're going with this, but look, I spared the best animals so that I could offer those to God. You know, so that we're just saving those for sacrifices. They're all going to get destroyed. Nah. If you read closely, he was keeping the stuff. But anyway, we'll get to the chase here, because Samuel now comes in with a prophetic word and kind of the last nail in the coffin. Now, Saul is going to continue reigning for a while, but in terms of his authority, it's gone at this point. So here's the message starting in verse 17. Samuel said, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel?" That kind of goes back to when he was called the first time, and Saul was real modest and like, hey, I'm a nobody. So he kind of goes back to that day, and he says, "Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. The Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, fight against them until they are consumed.' Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" Now Saul said to Samuel, "Hang on a second. I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I have gone on the mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and I have devoted the Amalekites to destruction. But the people took the spoil. The people took the sheep and the oxen and the best of things devoted to destruction to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." All right, let's just cut through this. Politicians are good at spinning things, and Saul seems to have become quite the politician here. Samuel, though, he's getting a word from the Lord, right? He's not like, Samuel is not riffing. He's not making this stuff. God is delivering a message to Saul. So Samuel can see right through all of this spin that's going on and these excuses and rationalizations, and he knows Saul's just keeping the good stuff. Saul's just keeping the good stuff. These are spoils of war, verse 19. These are spoils of war. These are not things that are, he was determined to sacrifice to God. I think he was at this point determined to sacrifice to God because he knows he's busted. But these were spoils of war. So Saul has rebelled against God. He has been disobedient. And now he's calling Samuel a liar, right? Samuel's like, "Hey, you did this. This is disobedience." No. I did not. I obeyed the word of the Lord completely. It's just all messed up, right? So the king begins backpedaling as fast as he can. He's confessing to Samuel now at the end. He begins, "Yes, I sinned. Verse 24, he blames it on the people. And we'll pick it up here. He says in verse 24, Saul said to Samuel, "I have sinned." That's a good start, by the way. That's a good start. "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words." Yes, because of those guys. Because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. It's really on them. It's really on the Israelites, okay? So not much of a confession when you're doing the kind of pointing like this as you're confessing. Literally pointing the finger at everybody else. The people. It's them, And in the end, Samuel is going to do, this elderly guy, I feel sorry for him here because Samuel is going to have to do what Saul did not do. He is going to have the Amalekite king brought to him, this guy Agag, and Samuel is literally going to chop this guy to pieces because Saul didn't do his job. Here are the final words. These are the last words Samuel is ever going to speak to King Saul. Here they go. This is 1 Samuel 15, starting in verse 27. "As Samuel turned to go away." So Saul gets, this is not good. This is a turning point. Nail in the coffin of my dynasty here. "So as Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe and it tore. Samuel spun around. Samuel said to him, 'The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret.'" In other words, the word has been spoken. This word is not going to change. You will not keep the kingdom. There are many, many, many ways that we can find for ourselves. We always got to make this personal, right? It's easy to pick on Saul, but there are so many ways, imaginative ways, that we can create or discover for not totally obeying God, for partially obeying God, or for obeying God a little late, right? For delaying our obedience. And in the end, it's like the old song says, God just asks us to trust and obey. Trust and obey. When God's servant understands what God's will is for them, and they say yes, and they line up their words and they line up their actions, their talk and their walk, and hopefully their hearts up, then they are exactly where they're supposed to be. Because God is God. His word is final. Jesus, centuries later, descendant of David, this neighbor who's going to take Saul's throne away from him. Jesus, descendant of David, he will be the king who brings true peace. He goes to battle for his people. Jesus is wounded mortally for his people. He makes peace between his people and God with his own blood. And Jesus is a servant king. Not out there building monuments to himself, is he? Jesus is a servant king who loves us enough to speak truth to us and to invite us to join in his redemptive work in the world.